Rathinam, and a special thanks to Muruhan, who was scheduled to speak Friday, but Ramon Grima is under the weather, and so Muruhan was kind enough to step in, move his talk from Friday to Tuesday. And you can read the title, so I'll let Muruhan take it away.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And I don't think moving from Friday to Tuesday is a big deal. It was a no-brainer, as we say. Okay, so this talk is in collaboration with my former PhD student Ting Wang, who is now a postdoc at University of Delaware. So what I'm going to talk about is basically our Monte Carlo methods for parametric sensitivity estimation, but not so much about the methods, but a theoretical explanation for why one method does better or worse than the other methods. Okay, so I'll have a quick overview of stochastic chemical kinetics, which I think most people don't need that. And then a quick overview of the Monte Carlo methods for sensitivity estimation, a comparison of those methods, and then the explanation seems to depend on system size for the difference among the methods, and explain using that via a simple illustrative example where you can calculate things analytically, and then present some theoretical results, show some numerical results that verify the theoretical result, and speculate on some theoretical efficiencies. Okay. So everyone's familiar with the stochastic model of chemical kinetics, so this slide is more for my notation. So X sub I denotes the copy number of species I at time t, and there are m reaction channels, n species, and nu j is the stoichiometric vector. When reaction j happens, the state jumps by nu j. The propensity of a reaction channel j is denoted by aj of x. Rj of t counts the number of firings of reaction j during the interval 0 to t. So it's a counting process. And we have this equation that Tom Kurtz also wrote down, and where nu is the stoichiometric matrix whose columns are nu j. So now we are interested in how parameters enter this model. So basically this model is specified once these nu j's and the functions aj are specified. So then you have a well-defined mathematical model, but the things that vary are the parameters. The nu j's come directly when you write down an abstract chemical equation. Say S1 plus S2 goes to S3 and so on. When you write that, pretty much the nu j's come out of that. There are no parameters there. But the way the propensities depend on the state also involves some parameters. Okay, so we are interested in how sensitive is the model to the parameters, and one way to characterize the sensitivity is via a partial derivative. So you look at a function of the state at a specified time t and take the expected value, and now that's just a number or deterministic quantity, and it's a function of c, the parameters. So defining the sensitivity, this is a local measure of sensitivity, is a useful way to characterize, say, which parameters affect the system more strongly, and also if you want to fit parameters, even in that problem, often you will have an optimization type problem where you will need to search the parameter space to find the parameters that best fit your data. And doing that involves frequently computing derivatives like this. Okay? So how can we compute this? We don't have analytical formula for these quantities in general, so this has to be done numerically. Okay. So just to say that this will capture, for example, first moment, second moment, or even probabilities of belonging to a set by using indicator functions. Okay. So just to compare the problem with the deterministic situation, so if you switch to a deterministic model, and let's say you call AJ bar the deterministic reaction rate, then your model will be simply a ODE, where this right-hand side F is given by this. Okay. So then the problem of computing sensitivity, that will be the sensitivity of the solution with respect to C, is simply comes down to solving. So this partial derivative satisfies another ODE, which is the linearization of that ODE. And so it comes down to just simultaneously solving this ODE and this ODE. Okay? And then if you want this thing, it's just chain rule. Okay? So deterministic sensitivity problem is relatively more straightforward. Okay? So it's solving another, you add on an extra ODE. But in contrast, for stochastic case, there are many seemingly different approaches. Okay? So if you want a naive idea might be to say, okay, we have these Kolmogorov's forward equations, or the master equation, where the probabilities are going to depend on parameter C. So can we try and compute the partial derivatives of these probabilities? After all, this is an ODE. So the problem is this is potentially an infinite system of ODEs. And secondly, even when the process remains in a bounded set, this is a very large system of ODEs, where the number of equations and variables grows exponentially in the number of species n. So let's say you have 10 species, each one of them are present in numbers 0 to 10, so you have 11 to the 10 states. So everyone's familiar with that concept too, so it makes sense that Monte Carlo methods are the best way to do it. Okay, so what are the Monte Carlo methods? So before I go there, I want to mention the same equation that Tom showed yesterday, which is the random time change representation. And here, these yj's are unit rate Poisson processes. So the nice thing about here is that the yj's don't know anything about the parameters. Okay, so they are independent of the parameters. So this way, you can think of this as isolating the randomness from the parameters. So you specify a path for these yj's, then you can compute the corresponding path for x purely by a deterministic procedure. Okay? So this is a stochastic equation for the same thing instead of the master equation, this one. Okay. Okay, so the Monte Carlo estimation depends, all the methods I'm going to mention depend on computing what I call an underlying estimator, which can be computed from the knowledge of this function f, the parameter c, as well as the trajectory up to time t. Okay? And some estimators have expected value equal to the exact sensitivity. So in that case, it's an unbiased estimator. Others are close to it, but not exactly equal. So that's a biased estimator. And of course, to compute or estimate the mean expected value of this, you need to run a large number of samples, which are AID copies of this, and take the sample average. So in that case, what is the error? So first of all, I want to define three quantities in order to be able to talk about the error. One is the relative standard deviation of the estimator. So it's just a variance of this underlying estimator. It's the square root, so the standard deviation normalized by the actual sensitivity, which I assume is not 0. And if it's a biased estimator, the relative bias, and then the relative L2 error of this ultimate estimator. So this is the final quantity that we are interested in. Okay, we want to make that small. So you can write the relative error square of it in this way. Okay. Right. So a few examples of Monte Carlo sensitivity estimators. The most obvious natural one is the finite difference. So you approximate the derivative by this finite difference. Okay. Now there are some choices here. You can run the trajectory of x at parameter c plus h and the trajectory at parameter c in such a way that these two are completely independent processes. Okay, so that you run one simulation with parameter c, and then you run another simulation with c plus h, and with two completely different independent random number streams. So if you do that, you get what's called an independent random number finite difference method. The alternative is to use the same stream of random numbers for this and this. So that means these two are not independent processes, but they are correlated. And if h is small, they are very strongly positively correlated. Okay. The other approach, which is a little less obvious, is that actually using a change of measure, using Girsanov transformation, you can derive this method where all you have to do is to simulate this, and along with the simulation, you can compute a weight, z. So this weight process, or z as it's called here, and z in the other side of the Atlantic. So you compute the weight, and then you multiply this with the weight, and it's the expected value of this is the exact sensitivity unit. Okay. So this method has the advantage that it's an unbiased method, whereas this is a biased method. A third method is to use differentiate first and then take expectations. Okay. I will talk about it a little bit more in detail. So the formula for that estimator looks like this. Okay. And another one that I'm not going to talk about is a method by Ankit Gupta and Mustafa Kamash, which also provides for an unbiased estimate. Okay. It's a little bit more involved, but it's actually more efficient than the Girsanov. Right. Okay, so independent random numbers versus common random numbers. What's the difference? So the variance of this quantity, so remember the numerator of the finite difference is this minus this. Okay. So the variance of the numerator can be written in this way. If these two are independent, the third term is 0. But if these two are dependent and these two are strongly correlated, then you expect this to be much smaller. Okay? So remember, the efficiency of any Monte Carlo estimator depends on its variance being small, or in other words, the relative standard deviation being small. If this is small, you don't need many samples. If this is large, you will need several samples. Okay? Right. Okay, so finite differencing under the random time change representation. So instead of just running, say, the Gillespie algorithm, standard Gillespie algorithm, with parameter c plus h, and then with parameter c, but using the same stream of common random numbers, if you actually try to follow this equation in spirit, so look at this equation. Now I can stick parameters in here, right? So for a given parameter c, I generate m paths for y1 to ym, and from that path I can compute x, and that process is purely deterministic, right? So I can now use that path and use parameter c to compute this, and then use C plus H to compute this, keeping the same path. Okay, so that leads to a method that I worked on with Patrick Shepard and Mustafa Kamash, and we call it the common reaction path method. So it's a form of common random numbers, but it's a little bit more, I don't know, more mathematical or more in spirit of this equation. And we found that it had lower variance than just using any old common random numbers. And it leads to this estimator. So you can, again, it has the same formula. And then David Anderson here came up with a method which, again, also is a variation of this formula where you actually split this equation into two Poissons. So it was a method that was used by Tom himself a long time ago for analytical purposes, and that achieves even tighter coupling. So that gives even lower variance. Okay. All right. So what about differentiating first and then taking the expectation? So remember, the quantity that we want is this. Can we do this? The answer is no, because this process, if you look at it, it's integer valued. So if I fix omega, and that is a sample path, or if in terms of the random time change representation, if I fix the yj's, a path for the yj's, and if I fix t and vary c, it's the x is just going to be constant and then jump. Okay, so it's piecewise differentiable with derivative 0. Okay, so this is always 0. So you will get this to be 0, whereas the sensitivity you're trying to compute is really not 0. So this is one of the examples, real simple example, where the limits don't commute. So this is where a mathematician is usually happy, because often the engineers say, okay, why do you bother about the commutation of limits? In the real world, limits commute, okay? So, but here is an example, they don't, okay? So, with Patrick Shepard and Mustafa Kamash, I worked on this method called replace the final time, the state at the final time, with the time average over a small window, okay? Then compute the sensitivity of the expected value of this. Okay. That seems to commute, but unfortunately still under a strong condition called the so-called non-interference condition, which means for any state and any pair of reactions, if both can fire at that state, then the firing of one reaction should not, so let's say both J and K can fire at state X, and then K fires first, then you go to state X plus nu K. Then Aj of that should not be 0. In other words, two people are almost there waiting their turn, and by sheer randomness, one person just gets a little bit ahead, okay? And that person changes the state. Because they change the state, now the other person is prohibited from doing their thing. So that's the interference condition. So it's non-interference means that doesn't happen. If that doesn't happen, you can show this now will commute. Differentiating this and taking expectation is same as taking expectation and differentiating. Okay. We initially thought that this was not a big deal, but it is. Most chemical reactions don't satisfy this. But on the other hand, intuitively, unless you are close to the boundary of a component being non-zero, this will happen only rarely. So intuitively, you would expect the error in that this commutation won't hold, but it might be close. But then you can't quantify it, it's messy, so yeah. More on that later. Okay. So, but you can actually get an analytical formula for differentiating this. So that's easy to do. Okay. So when this holds, you can do this method. Okay. But it will be biased because you've changed f of x of t to something that's close to it. The Girsanov transformation method, which I don't want to talk about how it's derived, but it has, it was in the context of chemical kinetics, was introduced by Pliasanov and Arkin, and it involves really computing this auxiliary process, which is given by this equation. It's easy to compute because this integral is really a sum. All you have to do is compute the partial derivative of the propensity and its ratio to the propensity itself. And whenever reaction J jumps, you increment this by this quantity. And this is just a normal Riemann integral. And because these are constants in between jumps, this is just that constant value time, the waiting time in that state. So these are exactly computable. And in the case of, these are always martingales subject to integrability conditions. Now, when we are going to assume for most of the analysis in this paper this format for the propensity functions, which means that all the parameters are separate. For each reaction has its unique parameter, and it enters multiplicatively. And that's true for, say, the stochastic mass action form of kinetics, because it always just appears in the front. In that case, without loss of generality, we can say we are interested in parameter C1, and this weight process Z is simply the centered reaction count process divided by that parameter C. Okay? And one thing to note, this method doesn't work when this parameter itself is 0. Okay? Which is a shortcoming because you may not have a reaction in the system, but you might say, what is the sensitivity if I turn on that reaction, right? So then this method, as it in this form, is not applicable. Okay. So just to summarize, I mentioned 3, actually 4, but I'm not going to analyze the PPA method by Ankit. So the Girsanov transformation, the estimator is a random variable, a function of the sample path here. The finite difference is a random variable, function of the sample path. The regularized pathwise derivative is a function of the sample path here. Okay. Now, expected value of this is exactly the sensitivity, so it's an unbiased estimator. There are no method parameters to choose, so Girsanov transformation has all the attractive features, no tuning parameters, and it's unbiased. Both of these methods are biased, and they have method parameters. H is the finite difference perturbation. W is the regularization window. Right? And the problem is there is a bias variance trade-off. The bias goes to 0 if you let H go to 0 or W go to 0, but the variance blows up. Okay? So you try to make the bias small, variance blows up. And so you don't really know what exactly is the right thing to do. Okay. And among the finite difference methods, there is difference. Okay, so general CRN method is better than the general IRN method, independent random number. The common reaction path that I mentioned is better than this. Again, not always. Mostly is the operative word here. And CFD, the coupled finite difference, or the split coupling that Anderson put forward, is mostly better than CRP. We also noticed that mostly, again, the pathwise derivative has the lowest variance, but very restrictive because of this interference condition. Okay. Now, mostly, the Girsanov transformation has larger variance than the finite difference and the pathwise derivative methods. Okay. It can be modified by centralizing it. So Warren and Alan who just spoke before me, they had a paper in which they used basically, instead of so the Girsanov estimator is this, they subtracted the mean of f. Okay. And it makes no difference because if you pull this out, the z has 0 mean. So it has the same expected value. Okay, so it's an unbiased method. So we were intrigued. So my student, when he started his thesis, we really wanted to see, does this have lower variance than this all the time? And we tried to see if we can actually compute it in. There are some examples in chemical kinetics which things that have linear propensities, you can compute mean and variances exactly. Right? So we tried to see whether it's always true, can we prove it, why would it be true, and so that was the question that we were looking at. Okay. Okay. So just to show you a quick example, maybe I should skip in the interest of time. Okay, so here's a genetic oscillator example where you have the variances of pathwise derivative and Girsanov. There are orders of magnitude difference. Okay. Then we tried to see, does time play a role? So we looked at this reversible isomerization reaction. The sensitivity is known. Here, that's the blue line. It reaches steady state very quickly. And here are all the methods. And we use finite difference, just common random number, and it's slightly biased, so it's a little above. We plotted the variance as a function of time. They're all growing. Okay. But theoretically, we know the finite difference should level off, but it takes a long time. So here, this is the Girsanov, this is the centered Girsanov, which is smaller, but both are growing linearly in time. Okay. And theoretically, you can explain that OT behavior as t goes to infinity, but finite difference will actually level off. Okay. So if you run it for a much longer time, you get this leveling off, and this blue line is a upper bound, the absolute upper bound on the variance, when if the two processes are negatively correlated, right? And they are opposite and equal. Okay, so we realized the answer is in system size dependence, so which is the classical scaling that Tom talked about. So n is interpreted as a system volume, so the propensities depend on the state and the volume n in such a way that this limit exists, and that limit is the deterministic reaction rate. Okay. And so if you take this example where you have a bimolecular reaction, the parameter should depend on the volume inversely. The reason is two molecules, one molecule to find the other one, it's going to be inversely proportional to the volume. Right? So whereas monomolecular reaction doesn't have that thing here, this one. Okay, so you would have this limit. So then you have two parameters, the so-called deterministic parameters, which don't depend on n, and the stochastic parameters that depend on n. Okay. Now, if you scale the species this way, then Tom's result that he mentioned yesterday is that as n goes to infinity, the rescaled process converges on compact intervals of time to the solution of this ODE, and uniformly. Okay. So suppose now I'm estimating the expected value of an output function f, and let's say f scales as x to the alpha. And I'm going to estimate this. So since the process is scaling as n, or n, I would expect that f of xn would scale like O to the n alpha. And since the derivative is with respect to the parameter and not involve the state, if things are nice, you would expect the derivative partial also to scale like On. Okay? Right. So if the sensitivity is scaling like On to the alpha, how does the variance of the estimator scale? Okay. So let's look at a simple example, the pure birth process. It's just a Poisson process. And so here's the stochastic parameter. It should be proportional to system volume, right, in the classical scaling. Right. So this is the process because I'm scaling initial state. So the actual sensitivities here is this, okay? This is the expected value. It scales like ON. Now the Girsanov weight process is simply the centered reaction count divided by C. So which I can write as the unit Poisson with NCT inside. So now this is the Girsanov estimator. It's a polynomial in this Poisson variable. So I can square it, and all the moments of Poissons are known. So this looks like I will get n to the 4 because the fourth power of Poisson is appearing, but there will be a cancellation. I'll get n cubed. Okay. And another way to sort of see it is I can write that square this way. Okay. And this part converges by law of large numbers, the fluid limit, to this quantity, whereas this one, this is coming from the weight process, so it's a zero mean martingale. It will converge to Brownian motion by functional central limit theorem. So now you have the product. After some work, you can show that product will converge in expectation. So I divide by n cubed to this quantity. Okay. So it's ON cubed. Okay. So, but it's this way of looking at it that helps us to prove it for general case. Okay. The centralized Girsanov, if you do the calculation, comes out to be ON squared. Okay. Whereas the finite difference estimator, you can do independent random numbers, so where y and y tilde are independent, the variance will be this, ON. If you use common reaction path, y and y tilde are equal, then you will still get ON behavior, right? So regardless of whether you do independent random number, common random number, the variance scales like ON. Okay. So what is the relative standard deviation? So O here for the Girsanov, it's n cubed, square root of n cubed divided by n. So that's ON half. The centered method, O1, the finite difference, it decreases. So ironically, when the system size n gets larger, the system is really behaving more and more deterministic. The Girsanov transformation method, the estimator is having more variance relative to the mean of it. Right? So of course one might a priori say, but you are in the fluid limit, why do you need stochastic estimators? Well, the problem is when n is modestly large, this might start affecting. I mean, if you look at the ratio of these two, there is a big ratio. So even when n is 100 or 10, there can be a difference. So for the general system size analysis, you have the weight process is a martingale like this. Then we can prove that the Girsanov weight process, so under this assumption, that this converges to a Gaussian process, which has zero mean and its variance is given by this. Okay. And you can prove the uniform integrability of this sequence. So from that, you can prove that this is ON. So in this proof, we assume that the process remains bounded, okay, in a bounded domain. So relaxing that will probably involve using some stopping arguments. Okay. So system size analysis continued. So if I have f is growing with x like this, then the sensitivity scales like n to the alpha. The bias of the finite difference scales like n to the alpha. And the second moment of the Girsanov estimator exactly converges to this. Okay. Therefore, the variance is, so this is also order 1 plus n to the 1 plus 2 alpha. Therefore, the relative standard deviation is O n square root n, and that doesn't depend on what this alpha is. Okay. We have to assume that f is continuous for this and C1 for this. Okay. And similarly, the second moment, and therefore the variance is at most O to the n2 alpha. Therefore, the relative standard deviation is O1. Okay. And the finite difference, the relative standard deviation is O n minus half. So this is the summary. So this explains why the Girsanov frequently, even though it's unbiased and nice, seems to have very large variance, throwing you off. So here is an example. So we took this example and then we fixed the initial concentration and then we started scaling n. And here is, this is f of x is x1, so you would expect the sensitivity to scale linearly. And these are all the estimated values, but you know, it scales linearly. But more interesting is the relative standard deviation. So you can see the Girsanov growing, so this is a log-log scale. Girsanov growing like slope half. The centered Girsanov is flat, and both the finite difference and RPD we did not analyze, but we believe it should be similar to finite difference. So it goes down like n to the half. And I also believe the Poisson path algorithm by Ankit and Mustafa also should go down. Okay. And similarly, we tested different output function, the square of the state. Again, we get the same thing. We tested a sine function, and again, it's the same. We then looked at a nonlinear system of reactions that was introduced by Gillespie in his early work, and it's also doing the same. Okay, so now what can we do about trying to speculate? How much time do I have? Okay, good. So this part is a little speculation. The reason is, okay, so when n gets larger, we did the analysis. But we also know finite difference depends on h. So in my previous analysis, in our analysis, we perturbed the stochastic parameter, not the stochastic parameter, sorry, the deterministic parameter. So it did not depend on n. And the perturbation h then did not depend on n. Right? So you may ask that really a practitioner is computing the sensitivity with respect to the stochastic parameter, not the deterministic parameter, right? In that case, this scaling that I mentioned, the O(n) cubed and O(n) squared will be different, but when you compute the relative standard deviation, it'll be the same, because the stochastic sensitivity and the deterministic sensitivities are just off by a power of n, okay? So therefore, it makes no difference which one you study. This conclusion is the same, okay? So now coming back here, okay, now we know that it depends on h. Can we speculate how it's going to depend when n is large and h is small? Okay, so we did not prove the joint limit. It will require a little bit more, but it can be done, we believe, but we need to assume a little bit more regularity in the things. Okay. So the relative bias of a finite difference method we showed asymptotically independent of n. So there is a constant, but it depends on h like some power. So h to h1, h if it's one-sided finite difference, h squared if it's centered finite difference. Okay. Now the relative standard deviation then depends, as a square of it depends inversely on n, but it will depend the variance. So I need to tell that the variance, if you use independent random numbers, the variance will be 1 over h squared, the way it depends on h. Okay. If you use common random numbers, most of the time, it'll be 1 over h. Okay. So this is something that I didn't have time to explain, but so that's why I'm looking at two possibilities for the power of h here. So that'll give you an approximation for the relative mean square error, relative square error in this way. Now you can do what Peter Glynn and Asmussen do in their textbook on Monte Carlo simulations. The idea is to minimize this over h, okay? I am missing a 1 over ns here, okay? So there is a typo here. There should be a 1 over number of samples. N is system size, ns is number of samples. Okay. So what Peter Glynn does is similar, except they don't have a system size in their calculation, okay? So the idea is to choose h as a function of n system size and sample size, n sub s, so that this is minimized. So when you do that, you will get h is proportional to system size and sample size in this way, and the minimal relative square error will be like that. Okay. So now suppose I prescribe a relative error tolerance epsilon, then I can ask what is the number of samples required, number of simulations. And for a finite difference, it's going to be proportional to these two quantities in this way. Now theoretically, the best you can do in terms of epsilon dependence is epsilon minus 2. Okay? So for an unbiased estimator, take the Gisenoff transformation. The number of simulations required will be n epsilon minus 2. So if you only look at epsilon dependence, finite difference is worse. Okay? Because gamma 2 is never 0. Gamma 2 is 0 means that the method is actually pathwise differentiable. Okay? That method can be applicable, which is not the case here. But if you include system size into the consideration, then finite difference can be more efficient. So the idea is here, for Gisenoff transformation, the number of simulations is n epsilon to the minus 2. Centered, there is no dependence on n, so centered Gisenoff is superior to Gisenoff. The finite difference is going to be more efficient than the centered Gisenoff if n is large enough. Okay? So for example, if you use a common random numbers and centered finite difference, we know gamma 2 and gamma 1, that will give us n should be much larger than square root of 1 over square root of epsilon. But this is sort of a little bit theoretical because you don't really know these constants, and it's not clear how exactly to choose h. And also comparing a biased method with an unbiased method is a little bit philosophical, because you always prefer a biased method because you can put nice confidence intervals. So I will take this calculations with a grain of salt, but bottom line is, if you have two methods, one method is unbiased, the other one is biased. The unbiased is preferred unless its variance is so much larger than the biased one. So just to conclude, we talked about these are the only three unbiased methods that I know. I have a suspicion PPA will be more efficient when system size gets modestly large, because even though we didn't analyze it, but it's going to have similar dependence with system size as finite difference. Okay. And a nice approach is multi-level Monte Carlo, where you can combine a biased method with an unbiased method, provided you can couple them tightly. So one example is by Wolf and Anderson. Okay? And the other thing to speed up these things is to use tau leaping. So tau leaping will give you biased estimates, but faster. And again, couple that with an unbiased method. Okay? So take PPA method, and that could be expensive, but if you do a tau leaping coupled with PPA and couple it with the straight PPA, then that could lead to a good method. Okay, so I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, I'll take them.
Can you quickly comment which of the method can handle initial condition as parameters and which cannot?
Sorry.
So when you have chemical reaction networks, I agree with you, most of the parameters are the reaction rate.
Yes,
linear with the reaction rate.
yes.
But some key parameters are also in the initial conditions sometimes.
Okay, we have, right, we have not looked at that type of situation. Well, technically, initial state is integer valued, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be, yeah. And also, we did not look at, for example, the first time to reach a state. So those are interesting questions. Yeah. Again, there the Gibson works. The first time to reach something. Yeah.
Hold off my questions. Any other questions though before we break for coffee? Okay, let's thank Muruhan again.
Okay.